The empty pegboard stopped Daniel Mercer cold before he even noticed his father's workbench was gone. He stood just inside the workshop door with one hand still wrapped around the brass knob, staring at pale rectangles on the plywood walls where wrenches, clamps, and drill bits had hung for 30 years. The fluorescent tubes overhead buzzed with a thin electric whine, throwing hard white light across a concrete floor swept almost clean. Almost. A few curls of steel wool clung near the baseboard, and the place still carried the familiar smell of cutting oil, cedar dust, and hot metal. Only now it felt diluted by cold air and fresh emptiness. Claire! His voice traveled farther than it used to. There were no shelves packed with coffee cans full of bolts to swallow the sound. No red Craftsman chest against the west wall. No belt sander humming from a forgotten switch. His wife appeared in the doorway behind him, heels clicking twice against the concrete before she stopped. Claire Mercer still wore the cream blouse and charcoal slacks she had worn to work, one hand holding her phone, the other tucked under her elbow. "You're back early." Daniel turned slowly. His gaze moved past her to the open bay door, where late afternoon sunlight cut a bright gold rectangle across the floor. Dust drifted through it like ash. "Where is everything?" Claire glanced around as though he had asked where she had put a stack of old newspapers. "Gone." A muscle moved once in Daniel's jaw. "Gone where?" She unlocked her phone and tapped the screen. "I called an estate liquidator. Then a scrap buyer took what they didn't want. The larger machines went yesterday. Somewhere outside, a pickup rolled over loose gravel, tires crunching until the sound faded down the county road." Daniel looked toward the corner where his father's South Bend lathe had stood. 4 dark anchor marks remained in the concrete, each surrounded by a clean ring where oil and dust had protected the floor from age. "You sold Dad's lathe." Daniel, it was 70 years old. He rebuilt that machine himself, and nobody was using it. Claire's voice stayed even. She stepped farther inside, wrinkled her nose at the lingering smell of oil, then gestured toward the stripped walls. "Look at this place. Your father kept everything. Broken vices, rusted drill presses, coffee cans full of screws from 1985. We've been paying taxes and insurance on a building full of junk." Daniel walked to the wall where the workbench had been. His fingers brushed a shallow groove in the wood trim, smooth from decades of his father sliding metal stock across it. "You could have called me." "I did, twice, while I was meeting the probate attorney." Claire exhaled through her nose. "And you didn't answer." "Daniel, your dad has been gone 6 months. At some point, this stops being a shrine." The fluorescent ballast clicked overhead. Daniel's hand went still against the wall. Claire looked toward the bay door instead of at him. "The liquidator gave us more than I expected. $23,000 for everything." Daniel finally faced her. "Everything. Everything worth selling." She slipped the phone into her purse. "And before you start, I already know what you're going to say, but sentiment doesn't pay property tax." His eyes traveled across the naked room again. Empty electrical outlets, sawdust packed into hairline cracks, a single bent washer glittering near the drain. Then his gaze reached the north wall. Unlike the others, it remained untouched. Gray drywall, 2 vertical seams, an old steel electrical box mounted shoulder high, and beneath it, faintly visible through years of grime, the pencil line his father had drawn beside the workbench when Daniel was a teenager. Daniel crossed the room. His boots made hollow, measured knocks on the concrete. Claire watched him without moving. He stopped 3 feet from the wall and stared at the lower right corner, where Walter Mercer had once slapped Daniel's hand away from a drill and said only one thing: "Never put a hole in this wall." Daniel lifted his fingers toward the drywall, but didn't touch it. Behind him, Claire's keys jingled softly as she shifted her weight. "What now?" she asked. Daniel studied the wall for another second. Then he turned. "Did anybody break into this?" Claire frowned. "Into what?" Daniel looked back at the unmarked drywall. "This wall." Claire's answer came too quickly. "No, nobody touched the wall." Daniel kept his eyes on the gray drywall while the fluorescent tubes buzzed above him. The workshop had cooled with the bay door open, and a thin draft carried the smells of dry grass and old cutting oil across the bare concrete. Claire's heels clicked toward the exit. Can we please go home? Daniel crouched beside the wall instead. He ran his thumb over the scarred baseboard, then reached for the bent washer near the floor and rolled it between his fingers. His father used to keep washers exactly like that in a blue Maxwell house above the workbench. Walter Mercer believed almost anything could earn another useful life if a man had enough patience to repair it. Daniel had learned that here, standing on an overturned milk crate because he was too short to reach the vise. He could still hear the rasp of a file against steel and the low country station Walter kept playing from a paint-speckled radio. The shop had smelled stronger then. Machine oil, hot metal, black coffee. Walter's hands were always rough with tiny cuts and gray dust caught in the creases. One Saturday, when Daniel was 16, they had been installing a rack beside the north wall. Daniel had lifted a cordless drill and marked a stud location with a pencil. Walter crossed the shop so fast his stool scraped backward across the concrete. He caught Daniel's wrist before the bit touched drywall. Not there. Daniel had laughed. Why? You hide Jimmy Hoffa back there. Walter took the drill from him. The joke never reached his face. He rubbed away Daniel's pencil mark with his thumb, leaving a dark smear. You need a shelf? Put it somewhere else. It's a wall, Dad. Walter looked at it for a long second. Then it ought to be easy to leave alone. He never explained further. Daniel had eventually stopped asking. Now, 26 years later, that same wall was the only surface Claire's cleanup hadn't stripped bare. Daniel. Claire stood beside the open bay, framed by amber sunlight. I'm leaving. He rose and walked toward the center of the shop. Who bought Dad's workbench? I don't know. The lathe. The liquidator handled it. His Kennedy toolbox. Claire tightened her grip on her purse. Same answer. Daniel crossed to a utility closet and pulled open his metal door. The hinges squealed. Inside, the shelves had been cleared except for a push broom, a roll of paper towels, and Walter's old red shop rag hanging from a nail. Daniel took the rag down, folded it once, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Then he grabbed the broom. Claire stared at him. What are you doing? Cleaning. The place is already empty. Not the same thing. He pushed the broom across the floor in long strokes. Fine metal dust whispered over concrete. He worked around the anchor holes where the lathe had stood, under the empty pegboard, along the marks left by cabinets that would never return. Each pass changed the room. Not back into Walter's workshop. That was impossible. Into something Daniel could finally look at without Claire deciding what disappeared next. Claire checked her phone. You're being dramatic. Daniel stopped sweeping. You sold 30 years of Dad's tools without me. I sold objects. You made that distinction for both of us. Claire's mouth tightened. I'm not apologizing for clearing out a dead man's workshop. Daniel rested both hands on the broom handle. The refrigerator compressor in the office kicked on with a dull vibration, and somewhere outside a cicada rattled from the fence line. I'm not asking you to. That made Claire pause. Daniel walked to the electrical panel and shut off the breakers one by one. The fluorescent lights blinked out, leaving the workshop washed in orange light from the bay door. He closed the utility closet, checked the windows, then pulled the bay door down until its steel rollers clattered into the tracks and the final strip of sunlight vanished. Claire watched him lock it. What exactly is this supposed to accomplish? Daniel slipped the key from his ring. You wanted the workshop emptied. Fiend it. He placed the key in his pocket instead of handing it to her. But until Dad's estate is settled, nobody comes inside again without me. Claire's eyes moved toward the locked door. Daniel, you can't just decide that. He met her gaze. I just did. By breakfast, Claire had already turned Daniel's locked workshop into someone else's property. The kitchen smelled of burnt toast and dark roast coffee, and morning sun flashed against the stainless steel refrigerator as Daniel walked in wearing the same jeans from the night before. Claire sat at the island with her laptop open, one bare foot hooked around the stool rung, clicking through emails as if yesterday had ended normally. Daniel poured coffee. The ceramic mug was hot against his palm. The estate attorney called me at 7:12. Claire's fingers stopped above the keyboard. Daniel set the mug down without drinking. He asked whether I knew about the purchase agreement. The refrigerator hummed between them. Claire lowered the laptop screen halfway. I was going to tell you. When? When everything was finalized, Daniel pulled out the stool opposite her, but remained standing behind it. Everything. Claire rubbed her thumb along the edge of her wedding ring. The building, the lot, all of it. Daniel's hand tightened around the stool back. You sold Dad's workshop. We accepted an offer. Claire pushed the laptop toward him. A signed purchase agreement filled the screen. The property address sat beneath Walter Mercer's name, followed by a closing date only 4 business days away. The property was costing money every month, she said. The county assessment went up. Insurance went up. The roof needs work. You weren't making decisions, Daniel, so I started making them. He scrolled slowly. Claire's electronic signature appeared beside his. As authorized representative under paperwork they had signed months earlier to handle routine estate expenses while Walter was in hospice. Daniel looked up. That authorization was for bills and maintaining assets. Selling the asset isn't maintaining it. Claire snapped the laptop shut. The sound cracked across the kitchen. The attorney says the agreement is enforceable unless the buyer agrees otherwise. Daniel said nothing. He picked up his truck keys. 25 minutes later, his F-150 rolled onto the gravel shoulder outside the workshop. Tires ground over limestone chips, and dry Texas heat shimmered above the hood, even though it was barely 10. Daniel unlocked the side door. Inside, stale oil and warm plywood met him again. Without the fluorescent lights, narrow beams of sun leaked around the bay door and stretched across the empty floor. He walked straight to the north wall. Claire had sold the tools. Now she had sold the building around it. Daniel pulled a tape measure from his truck and began working. 24 feet along the exterior. He stepped inside and measured again, not hunting for hidden doors or trying to solve his father's warning, just establishing what would soon belong to another man. He photographed the north wall, the electrical box, the floor, and every untouched seam in the drywall. Then he printed the purchase agreement from the tiny office printer Walter had kept beside an ancient filing cabinet. Warm paper slid into Daniel's hand with the sharp smell of toner. A vehicle approached outside. Claire's SUV stopped beside his truck. She entered without knocking, sunglasses still on. You left without finishing the conversation. Daniel folded the agreement once. Who bought it? Claire removed her sunglasses. A contractor named Ethan Cole. You met him at the property walkthrough last week. Daniel's eyes stayed on hers. Last week. Claire set her purse on the empty windowsill. Yes. The word landed cleanly. No excuse followed it. Daniel looked toward the stripped pegboard, then the 4 anchor marks where Walter's lathe had stood. Claire had been arranging the sale before she emptied the room. The liquidation hadn't been cleanup. It had been preparation. How much? $185,000. A cicada screamed outside, then stopped abruptly. Daniel folded the agreement again and slid it into his back pocket. Cancel it. Claire shook her head. No. Ask Cole to release the property. I'm not doing that. Daniel stepped between her and the north wall, not touching her, simply occupying the space his father had guarded for decades. Claire picked up her purse. Closing is Friday at 3. After that, the keys belonged to Ethan. She walked out, and the side door slammed hard enough to rattle the empty electrical box. Daniel stood motionless until her engine faded down the road. Then he took his phone from his pocket, found the buyer's number on the agreement, and pressed call. When a man answered, Daniel looked directly at the north wall. Mr. Cole, this is Daniel Mercer. Before you take possession Friday, there's one thing inside that workshop you need to hear from me. Ethan Cole arrived Friday carrying a pry bar, a laser measure, and no interest in Daniel's family history. His white work truck rolled through the gravel at 2:47, 13 minutes before closing, with aluminum ladders rattling against the roof rack. Inside the workshop, afternoon heat had baked the plywood walls until the air smelled of dry lumber and old oil. Daniel stood beside the empty workbench marks while Ethan walked the room in dusty boots, tapping notes into his phone. He was maybe 45, broad through the shoulders, with sawdust caught in the seams of his leather tool belt. Your message made this sound serious, Ethan said. Daniel pointed toward the north wall. My father had one rule about this building. Nobody opened that wall. Ethan aimed his laser measure across the room. A red dot trembled against the drywall. Any reason? He never gave me one. Ethan lowered the device. Electrical? There's a box mounted there. Plumbing? Not that I know of. Ethan walked closer and pressed his palm against the gray surface. The drywall felt solid beneath his fingers. He crouched, inspected the baseboard, then stood again. I'm converting this side into a restoration bay. That wall has to come out. Daniel's gaze settled on the pencil line, still visible near the lower corner. Then I wanted you to hear the warning before it became your wall. Tires crunched outside. Claire entered carrying a manila closing envelope. The scent of her perfume briefly cutting through the workshop's stale machine oil smell. Her eyes moved from Daniel to Ethan. Why are you here? Daniel answered first. I called him. Claire's mouth flattened. Of course you did. Ethan clipped the laser measure back onto his belt. Mr. Mercer told me about the north wall. Claire gave a short laugh. Walter had 100 strange rules. Don't throw away bent nails. Don't leave a wrench on concrete. Don't touch that wall. He was an old machinist, Ethan. Everything had a ritual. Maybe. Ethan glanced at the wall again. But I'm still removing it. Claire extended the envelope. Good. Then we're done. At 3:14, the transfer was recorded. Daniel watched Claire place the workshop keys into Ethan's open palm. Metal clicked against calloused skin. That small sound carried through the empty room more sharply than the fluorescent buzz ever had. The building where Walter had spent 30 years repairing engines, machining brackets, and teaching Daniel how to hold a file now belonged to a stranger. Claire slid the signed documents into her purse. It's finished. Daniel looked around once. No latte. No red tool chest. No skateboard bench. Even Walter's battered radio was gone. Only the north wall remained exactly where it had always been. Ethan stepped outside and returned with a cordless impact driver. The motor gave a high electric chirp as he tested the trigger. Claire turned toward him. You're starting today? Just marking demolition. He pulled several screws from a section of shelving track beside the wall, then stretched a chalk line across the drywall. Blue powder snapped against gray paint with a dry pop. Daniel watched the line appear from floor to ceiling. Claire checked her watch. Daniel, are you coming? He didn't move. Ethan opened a folded renovation plan across the hood of a rolling cart. This wall separates the old machine area from about 6 feet I need for the new bay. Monday morning, my crew strips it to the studs. Daniel looked at him. All of it. All of it. Claire gave Daniel a tired glance and walked toward the door. There. Mystery solved. It's drywall and studs. Ethan studied his plan, then pointed to the center of the north wall. Actually, first cut goes right here. Daniel's eyes followed his finger to the exact section Walter had forbidden him to drill 26 years earlier. Outside, Claire started her SUV. The engine turned over, gravel cracking beneath the tires as she pulled away from the workshop she had emptied and sold. Ethan folded the plans, switched off the lights, and locked his new building. At the trucks, he held out his hand to Daniel. Whatever your father's reason was, you've got the weekend to make peace with it. Daniel looked past him at the dark workshop windows. Ethan opened his truck door. 7 Monday morning, that wall comes down. At 7:06 Monday morning, Ethan's pry bar punched through the north wall and stopped against something that should not have been there. The workshop rang with the impact, a sharp metallic crack beneath the whine of a shop vacuum and the gritty scrape of boots across concrete. White drywall dust floated through shafts of morning light spilling from the open bay door, carrying the dry smell of gypsum into air still stained with decades of machine oil. Daniel stood 10 feet away, arms folded, watching Ethan widen the first opening along the blue chalk line. Claire had refused to come. At breakfast, she had pushed her coffee cup into the sink and told him, "It isn't our building anymore. Whatever Cole does with it is his problem." Daniel had answered by taking his truck keys from the counter. Now Ethan hooked the pry bar behind a broken sheet and pulled. Drywall snapped away in a jagged 3-foot section. Insulation should have appeared behind it. Instead, Ethan stopped. Well, Daniel stepped closer. Behind the drywall stood red brick. Not decorative veneer. Full masonry, dark with age, running vertically from the concrete slab toward the rafters. Ethan brushed plaster dust from one brick with his glove. Your dad built this? Not that I ever saw. Ethan knocked twice with the rubber handle of his pry bar. Solid. He moved 3 feet left and knocked again. The sound changed. Not much. Just enough. A deeper note rolled behind the brick and died somewhere beyond it. Ethan looked at Daniel. Daniel said nothing. Ethan knocked again. Hollow. The shop vacuum clicked off, leaving only the ticking of cooling metal from Ethan's truck outside and a distant cicada buzzing beyond the fence. Ethan pulled a masonry bit from his case. I'm checking what's behind it. Daniel stepped forward. Wait. Ethan lowered the drill. Your father's rule? Daniel stared at the bricks. For 26 years, Walter's warning had been nothing more than a sentence attached to gray drywall. Now there was another wall behind it. Something deliberately built. Something Claire's liquidators had passed within inches of while carrying Walter's life out through the bay door. Daniel took out his phone. Give me 5 minutes. Claire answered on the 4th ring. Daniel, I'm working. Cole opened the north wall. Silence replaced the faint tapping of a keyboard on her end. Daniel looked at Ethan. There's brick behind the drywall. The keyboard noise stopped completely. So, Claire said. The word came softer than the others. It's hollow in the center. Another pause. Daniel heard fabric rustle against the phone. Tell him to stop. His eyes narrowed. You said whatever he did was his problem. I changed my mind. Why? Because you're turning Walter's weird habits into some ridiculous treasure hunt. Claire's breathing came through the speaker, quick and shallow between her words. Daniel, listen to me. Do not let that contractor break those bricks. Daniel looked at the ragged drywall hanging from exposed screws. How do you know they're bricks? Nothing. Ethan slowly lowered the drill to his side. Daniel walked away from him, crossing the empty shop until his boots reached the 4 dark anchor marks where Walter's lathe had once stood. Claire. A chair scraped sharply across the floor on her end. To stop him. I'm coming. The call ended. Daniel lowered the phone. Ethan nodded toward the masonry. Your call. I own the building, but I can wait 20 minutes. Daniel looked through the open bay door at the gravel road shimmering under the rising Texas heat. Then he walked to the brick wall and pressed his palm against its rough surface. The mortar felt cool despite the warming shop. No, Ethan raised an eyebrow. Daniel stepped back and pointed at the hollow section. You bought this building to renovate it. Keep renovating. Ethan fitted the masonry bit into his hammer drill. The chuck snapped tight. He pulled on safety glasses, planted his boots, and squeezed the trigger. The drill screamed against brick. Red dust sprayed onto the concrete. After several seconds, the bit suddenly pushed through with almost no resistance. Ethan released the trigger. Silence rushed back into the workshop. He leaned toward the narrow hole. A faint current of cold, stale air touched his face. Ethan picked up a flashlight, aimed its beam through the opening, and froze. Daniel moved beside him. What is it? Ethan didn't answer. He set down the drill, grabbed a small sledge from his tool cart, and widened his stance. Then Claire's SUV came flying over the gravel outside, brakes grinding as it stopped crooked beside Daniel's truck. Her door opened before the dust settled. Ethan lifted the sledge toward the hollow section. Claire ran through the bay door. Don't! Ethan turned toward her. Claire pointed at the brick wall, her keys shaking audibly in her hand. I know what Walter put back there. Claire's words stopped the sledge in midair. Ethan lowered it slowly while the hammer drill ticked as it cooled on the concrete, and red brick dust hung in the hard morning light pouring through the bay door. Daniel turned toward his wife. Her cream blouse was damp between the shoulder blades from the Texas heat, and her car keys trembled against the silver ring looped around one finger. Say that again. Claire swallowed. Walter told me there was a space behind that wall. Daniel took one step closer. When? A few months before he died. The workshop went quiet except for the metallic ping of Ethan setting the sledge on his cart. Daniel's boots ground brick dust into the floor. You knew there was something back there when you emptied this place. Claire looked toward the damaged wall instead of answering. Ethan removed his safety glasses. This is between you two, but it's my building now. That wall still comes out. Claire moved in front of the opening. You don't understand. Then explain it, Daniel said. Her fingers closed around the keys until the edges pressed white marks into her skin. Walter said he kept old project records back there. Drawings, papers, things from his machining years. I thought he was exaggerating. Daniel stared at her. You thought that, and you still sold the building? I thought whatever mattered had already been removed. By who? Claire's mouth opened, then closed. Ethan picked up the sledge again. Step aside, ma'am. She didn't. Daniel reached past her, not touching her, and took the sledge from Ethan's hand. He turned toward the brickwork. Daniel. Claire's voice sharpened. He swung once. The sledge struck beside the drilled hole with a flat crack. Mortar fractured. A brick shifted inward and dropped somewhere beyond the wall, landing with a dull thud that echoed farther than it should have. Cold, stale air spilled through the opening, carrying the smell of paper, rust, and enclosed concrete. Claire backed away. Daniel swung again. Then Ethan joined him with a pry bar. 10 minutes later, an opening nearly 3 feet wide broke through the masonry. Ethan aimed his flashlight inside. The beam traveled across a narrow room, perhaps 6 feet deep and 12 feet long, sealed behind the workshop wall. Daniel stepped through first. The temperature dropped immediately. Dust coated his tongue. Under the flashlight beam sat a narrow steel desk, 2 metal shelving units, several wooden machinist cases, and a gray lockbox spotted with surface rust. Nothing glittered. No stacks of cash. No ciatriche il triasure. Just the private remains of a man who had spent his life measuring things to thousandths of an inch. Daniel touched the steel desk. It was cold beneath his fingertips. On one shelf lay photographs of Walter beside machines Daniel didn't recognize. Another held binders labeled by year in Walter's block handwriting. Ethan remained at the opening. Claire stayed outside. Daniel pulled one binder free. Paper whispered against paper as he opened it. Machining diagrams, measurements, correspondence. He closed it and reached for the gray lockbox. It wasn't locked. The lid groaned upward. Inside were folders protected in clear plastic sleeves, a stack of engineering drawings tied with cotton tape, and a large envelope marked Daniel in Walter's handwriting. Daniel's thumb stopped on the letters. Behind him, Claire finally entered the hidden room. Her shoes scraped over grit. That's what he told me about, she said. Daniel lifted the envelope but didn't open it. Beneath it sat another folder. The tab carried a name written in black marker. Walter Mercer. Claire stopped breathing loudly enough for him to hear it. Daniel pulled the folder from the box. She reached toward him. Daniel, wait. He moved it beyond her hand. You knew this room existed. You sold the workshop anyway. Now, Dad left a file with your name inside the wall you wanted gone. Claire's eyes stayed fixed on the folder. There's something you need to understand before you open that. Daniel slid his finger beneath the tab. Claire stepped directly between him and the exit. Because I already know why Walter made that file. Claire kept her body between Daniel and the opening until Ethan switched on a second work light. Harsh white glare filled the narrow room, sharpening every grain of brick dust and every rust stain on the steel desk. The air smelled of old paper and damp mortar. Daniel held the folder against his chest. Move. Claire's eyes flicked toward Ethan. Can we talk alone? You had 6 months. Daniel stepped sideways. Claire blocked him again. This time, Ethan rested one hand on the broken brick edge. Mrs. Mercer, this is my property now. If he wants to read papers his father addressed to him, I'm not stopping him. Claire's shoulders dropped an inch. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. Walter and I argued about this place before he died. Daniel's thumb stopped beneath the folder tab. How many times? 3. About selling it? Claire nodded. He knew the land was worth more than the building. I told him you'd never let it go while he was alive, and after he was gone you'd keep paying for an empty workshop because you couldn't separate him from it. Daniel opened the folder. The first page was dated 9 months earlier. Walter's block handwriting filled half a yellow legal sheet. Claire came again today, asking what the property could bring if sold. Daniel turned the page. Another date. Another note. Claire asked whether machinery would be included in valuation. The next sheet was a printed email from Claire to Walter. Daniel read silently while the work light hummed beside him. Her message asked whether Walter would consider selling the parcel before Daniel turned it into a permanent memorial. Daniel lifted his eyes. You were trying to sell it while Dad was alive. I was trying to make him realistic. He was dying, and we had decisions coming. Daniel laid the pages on the steel desk one at a time. Paper rasped against cold metal. There were copies of property estimates Claire had printed, handwritten notes from Walter, and one unsigned purchase inquiry from a developer. Nothing suggested Claire had stolen anything. Nothing needed to. The dates did the work. Claire stepped closer. Walter hated me after that. Daniel picked up the final sheet. It was another note in Walter's handwriting. Told Claire no. Told her the workshop contents and north wall are not hers to dispose of. Daniel read the sentence twice. Claire stared at it over his shoulder. Outside the hidden room, a compressor kicked on with a low mechanical growl, sending a faint vibration through the concrete. Daniel folded the note along its existing crease. He warned you specifically. Claire pressed her lips together. Yes. And after he died, you emptied the workshop. Yes. Then you sold the building before I could stop you. Claire's voice dropped. Yes. Daniel placed the note back into the folder. For the first time, he opened the envelope marked with his own name. Inside was a single-type page and a small brass key taped to the bottom. He didn't read the page yet. He peeled off the key. It was short, old-fashioned, its teeth darkened with age. Ethan aimed his flashlight around the room. Does that fit the lockbox? Daniel shook his head. The box wasn't locked. Claire looked at the key, and something changed in her posture. She stepped backward until her heel struck loose brick. Daniel, he turned the key over. A tiny stamp number, 214, caught the work light. Claire reached for her purse. We should stop. Daniel looked directly at her. Why? Because Walter didn't show me everything. Her voice barely carried over the compressor. He showed me this room once from the doorway. He showed me the files, but he wouldn't let me pass the desk. Ethan swept his flashlight beyond the shelves. Its beam stopped against the far end of the hidden room, where a tall steel cabinet stood flush against what looked like another partition. Claire pointed at it. That's why I thought the important things were gone. The last time I came here before he died, that cabinet was empty. Daniel walked over and gripped its cold steel edge. He pulled. The cabinet scraped across concrete with a shriek that filled the workshop. Behind it stood another narrow wall, unfinished plywood framed by steel studs. At chest height was a small brass lock stamped with the same number. 214. Claire backed through the broken bricks into the workshop. Daniel slid Walter's key into the lock. It turned. Ethan raised the flashlight. Daniel put his hand on the plywood panel, but Claire's voice came from behind him. Before you open that, you need to know why I wanted this building sold before you ever found it. Claire's confession came before Daniel opened the second compartment. I knew your father had something valuable in there. The work light hummed against the brick, throwing Claire's shadow across the broken wall while fine red dust settled over her shoes. Daniel kept one hand on the unlocked plywood panel. How valuable? Claire looked at Ethan, then back at Daniel. Walter never gave me a number. He only said a company had contacted him about an old design. Daniel's fingers tightened around the brass key. So you emptied his shop because you thought you could find it. Claire shook her head. At first, yes. I searched the cabinets while the liquidator was working. I checked the desk, the machinist's chests, every drawer they carried out. There was nothing. Ethan's jaw shifted. And when you couldn't find it, you sold the building. I thought Walter had moved it. Daniel pulled the plywood panel open. Cold air rolled past his wrist, smelling of canvas, steel, and paper sealed away for years. Ethan raised the flashlight. The compartment was barely 3 feet deep. A canvas-wrapped object rested on 2 wooden blocks with a black document case beneath it. Daniel lifted the case onto the steel desk. 2 brass latches snapped open. Inside lay engineering drawings, correspondence, notarized assignments, and a thick envelope bearing the letterhead of an industrial equipment manufacturer. Daniel unfolded the first drawing. Precise black lines showed a compact mechanical coupling assembly, every tolerance marked in Walter's familiar drafting hand. Dad made this. Ethan leaned over the desk. Looks like a vibration-isolating coupling. Daniel opened the manufacturer's letter. The paper crackled loudly in the narrow room. The company had spent years evaluating Walter's design for use in heavy industrial equipment. A later letter contained licensing terms. Daniel's eyes stopped at the proposed royalty schedule. Claire stepped closer. That's what he wouldn't show me. Daniel continued reading. Walter had never accepted the original buyout. Instead, the correspondence showed negotiations for a licensing agreement that could generate substantial payments if the design entered production. Beneath those letters was a recorded intellectual property assignment dated 12 years earlier. Daniel read the first paragraph, then the second. His name appeared alone under assignee. Claire saw it. Her hand dropped from her purse. 12 years. Daniel checked the date again. Before we were married. He pulled another sheet free. Walter had transferred the design, drawings, improvements, and future licensing rights to Daniel, while retaining permission to continue developing the prototype in his workshop. The building had hidden the records. It had never owned the invention. Claire gripped the edge of the steel desk. But you didn't even know about it. Apparently, Dad wanted the paperwork protected until I needed it. Daniel finally opened the envelope marked with his name. Walter's typed page was short. Daniel read without speaking. His father explained that the design had started as a shop experiment and become something companies wanted. He had transferred it years earlier because he wanted whatever came from his work to belong to his son, not to the workshop, not to whoever someday bought the land. At the bottom, one sentence had been handwritten: a building can be sold. Make sure the work goes to the right hands. Ethan slowly looked around his newly purchased workshop. Then buying this place didn't buy me any of that. Daniel shook his head. No. Claire pulled out her phone. We need an attorney before anyone takes those documents. Daniel closed the case. I agree. She blinked. Daniel slid the original assignment back inside and latched it. My attorney. Claire stepped toward him. Daniel, we're married. If this is worth what that letter says, you emptied Dad's shop looking for it. His voice stayed low beneath the hum of the work light. Then you sold the building when you couldn't find it. Claire's phone remained frozen in her hand. Daniel turned to Ethan. I want photographs of everything exactly where we found it. And I want you present when these records are inventoried. Ethan nodded and raised his phone. Daniel then unwrapped the canvas bundle. Machine steel caught the flashlight in a clean silver arc. Walter's prototype, intact, engraved with a serial number matching the drawings. Claire stared at it without speaking. Daniel placed his father's letter beside it and called the attorney. When the line connected, he looked through the hole Ethan had broken in the wall. Across the workshop, Claire had stripped bare. I need you here today, Daniel said. My father left something behind, and it turns out Claire sold the only thing she had any claim to. 3 months later, Daniel carried the first piece of his father's old workshop into a new one with both hands. It was the scarred maple workbench Ethan had tracked down from the estate liquidator and bought back before it disappeared into an auction warehouse. The wood smelled faintly of oil even after decades of use, and its surface was rough beneath Daniel's palms, carved with drill marks, vice scars, and one black crescent where Walter had once dropped a hot bearing race. Morning light poured through the open bay doors of Daniel's new 40 by 60 foot shop outside town, warming the polished concrete, while an overhead fan pushed the clean scent of fresh-cut lumber through the building. Ethan lowered the other end of the bench onto its steel legs. Right there. Daniel stepped back. Right there. The legal work had been quieter than the demolition. Walter's recorded assignment had held. The prototype, drawings, improvements, and licensing rights had belonged to Daniel for 12 years, long before Claire emptied the workshop or arranged its sale. The manufacturer renewed negotiations once Daniel's attorney established the chain of ownership, and the final licensing agreement gave him enough money to build without selling Walter's work outright. Ethan kept the old property. Daniel never challenged that. The sale had been valid, and Ethan had bought it in good faith. More important, Ethan had been the man willing to break through the wall everyone else had treated as meaningless. Claire's part ended differently. There was no screaming courtroom scene, no dramatic public humiliation. Daniel simply stopped allowing her to make decisions in his name. They separated, their attorneys divided what actually belonged to the marriage. And Claire kept her share of the workshop sale she had pushed through so aggressively. It looked small on paper beside what she had been searching for. On the afternoon, she came to collect the last boxes from their house. Cardboard scraped across hardwood, and packing tape snapped beneath the quiet hum of the air conditioner. Claire paused at the front door. If I hadn't sold it, Ethan never would have opened that wall. Daniel held the door while she balanced a box against her hip. That's true. She waited, perhaps expecting more. So all of this happened because of me. Daniel looked at the box in her arms, then at the bare patch on the wall where one of their photographs had hung. No, you emptied something you thought had no value. Ethan opened something Dad knew did. Claire lowered her eyes and walked to her SUV. Daniel closed the door gently. Weeks later, the new workshop began to sound alive. A mill spun under bright LED lights. Compressed air hissed through blue lines overhead. Steel rang against a vise, and the warm smell of cutting fluid mixed with coffee from a dentist machine near the office. Daniel restored Walter's prototype instead of putting it behind glass. He mounted the original engineering drawing above the maple bench and framed Walter's handwritten sentence beneath it. A building can be sold. Make sure the work goes to the right hands. Ethan arrived one Saturday, carrying something wrapped in an old shop towel. Almost forgot. He placed a red brick on the bench. White mortar still clung to one edge. Daniel recognized it immediately. The first brick Ethan had removed from the hollow section of Walter's north wall. Daniel turned it in his hands, feeling its coarse face drag across his fingertips. Then he mounted a small steel shelf beneath Walter's photograph and set the brick there. No plaqué. No explanation. It didn't need one. Outside, late sunlight stretched through the bay doors and flashed across the restored prototype, turning slowly on the bench. Daniel switched off the mill. The shop settled into a low mechanical ticking as hot steel cooled. For a moment, the sounds were almost the same ones he remembered from childhood. He wiped his hands on Walter's old red rag, folded it beside the vise, and looked from his father's photograph to the brick. Claire had stripped the workshop until she believed nothing valuable remained, but the stranger who bought those empty walls had broken through one of them and returned to Daniel the only inheritance she could never sell. His father's work, his father's name, and the future Walter had hidden for him in plain darkness.